In the previous video we covered the cranial bones. Now let's go with the facial bones. The facial bones are at the anterior surface of the cranium, of the skull, and 14 bones make up the face. The importance of the facial bones, that they host the eyes, as well as they let the muscles attach to the bones, and they can just give us facial expressions, as well as they can move the jaw up and down so we can really chew. So let's start with the mandible, and this is the lower jawbone, which articulates with the temporal lobe through its condyle, the mandibular condyle that articulates with the fossa mandibulae, a mandibular fossa with the temporal bone. We have the ramus, the mandibular ramus. This is a vertical extension of the body on either side. This is for muscle attachments. And we have the areolar margin, superior margin, I'm sorry, this is the maxilla. The superior margin of the mandible contains sockets for the teeth to lie in. The other bone that makes up the facial bones is the maxilla, and the maxilla is a fused bone superior to the mandible. It has also an alveolar margin here, where as well similar function for the mandible. These are bony sockets that host the teeth in. And here there's the alveolar margins, both places. The Palatine process is here at the back. The Palatine process, I don't know, do you see that? Okay, the Palatine process. Okay, these are. And form the anterior hard palate, and they meet in the middle, forming the intermaxillary suture. The lacrimal bone, this is a tiny bone, the lacrimal bone. It's itty bitty tiny, here it is, forming the medial orbit wall between the maxilla, this is between the maxilla, and the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid, what we covered before, that was part of the crista galli, that forms the projection of the crista galli and the cribriform plate over there. So this is the lacrimal bone. Each lacrimal bone is pierced by an opening, a tiny opening. On here you really cannot see, I'm sorry, but it should be here, an opening, and another one in here. And these openings are the lacrimal fossa, which serves as a passageway for tears, the tear ducts. The Palatine bone, now we had the Palatine processes of the maxilla. Now behind that, posterior to the Palatine processes of the maxilla, we have the Palatine bones, and paired bones, they make up the posterior hard palate and part of the orbit, a little bit of here. Zygomatic bone, here is the zygomatic bone. This is lateral to the maxilla, lateral, and forms the portion of the face commonly called the cheekbone, and forms part of the lateral orbit. Here makes the lateral orbit, and articulates with the temporal bone. The nasal bone, this is the nasal bone, is a small rectangle shaped bone forming the bridge of the bone. Not much about that. Another one is the vomer. This is a blade shape. This is the bottom of the nose in the middle. Blade shaped bone is median plane of nasal cavity that form a posterior and inferior nasal septum, posterior at the back and inferior at the bottom. We also distinguish the last one in here, the inferior nasal conchae and thin curved bones protruding medially from the lateral walls of the nasal cavity. This is one of them, and this is the inferior nasal conchae, many of them. Paranasal sinuses. For the skull bones, the maxillary or the maxilla, the sphenoid was the bat shape. The ethmoid was that made the cribriform plate with the cristogalli and makes the anterior part, it's anterior to the sphenoid, as well as the frontal bones contain sinuses. Sinuses, air cavities in bones that lead into the nasal passages. These paranasal sinuses lighten the facial bones, because if it would be solid, it would be really, really heavy, and may act as a resonance chamber for speech for the organisms. The maxillary sinus is the largest one in here, and usually it can get inflamed, and at that case it turns into sinusitis. But any of the sinuses can get infected, so we can call it generally sinusitis. The sinusitis is the infection, and the result of the sinus infection is sinus headache that is localized over the inflamed area, and the mucosa inside of the cavities are swollen up and infected, and contains liquid or drainage, and it can drain into the nasal cavity. When the drainage is blocked, that is when surgical drainage is necessary to relieve the painful condition. The last bone is the hyoid bone. Hyoid, not really considered as part of the skull bone. The hyoid bone is located in the throat above the larynx, so the throat. And it serves as a point for attachment for many tongue and neck muscles. And I guess that's it so far.